This is DGMT's Learning Lunch, and I'm your host, Rahima Esop. For those listening today, you probably have heard that South Africa has declared gender-based violence a national disaster. The scale and impact in our communities is staggering. Of course, we need a strong response, making sure the justice system works for women and funding shelters for survivors. But what if we could stop violence before it happens? It starts with strengthening alcohol regulations to tackle heavy drinking, which often fuels violence. But there are other things that we could do to make our communities safer in the long run. This is the focus of today's conversation. We will talk about the different forms that prevention can take, from shaping the social conditions that influence behavior to how boys and men understand power, respect, and masculinity. I'm joined by Khahliso Mangwale, project lead of the GBV initiatives at the DG Murray Trust, and Kolping Mbumba, who is the director of operations at Heroes Academy. Welcome both.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Khahliso, also known as KG in some spaces. A good place to start this conversation is to talk about the main drivers of gender-based violence in the South African context. What makes our society so violent?
Violence, and specifically gender-based violence, is driven by a combination of factors, from structural, individual, social, societal, interpersonal, and these drivers are connected and they reinforce each other. Patriarchal harmful norms continue really to shape how men show up in relationships, and this informs control and entitlement and perpetuates violence. Harmful masculinity discourages males' vulnerability and help-seeking behavior, and that works on how they navigate their emotional control, self-control, and how they handle conflict. Economic inequality, unemployment are big drivers. They increase stress and frustration and dependency. And so these play out in relationships. Alcohol and substance abuse, as you've noted, excessive alcohol use is a key driver of intimate partner violence. And so it escalates violent behavior. Early exposure to violence and intergenerational trauma reinforces and perpetuates the cycle of violence. At community level, aspects such as social acceptance of violence, aspects such as stigma, victim blaming, the fear of retaliation allow and perpetuate violence silently in communities.
Thanks, KG. You've laid out a number of drivers of gender-based violence, but socioeconomic conditions, unemployment, poverty, living circumstances, childhood trauma, all of that affects both men and women. But if we look at who is committing the violence, both gender-based violence, sexual abuse, as well as murder, it's men. So Kolping, why are the main perpetrators men?
Like KG mentioned, you have varying factors that contribute to that. But I think at the core is how men are socialized as young boys. You, more often than not, young boys are left to figure it out until they come of age, depending on the cultural context, around the age of rite of passage. That's when young boys are expected within that 3 to 4 weeks learn all the core values and develop a healthy understanding of their masculine identity, and are miraculously expected to become good men when they come back from that, which is not the case. Boys, as young as possible, need guidance, especially when it comes to conflict resolution. They need guidance and they need examples of non-violent men. So a lack of that then informs the men that we end up dealing with as a country who are perpetrators.
Kolping, what's clear from the data is that men are not only killing women, but they're also killing each other. What does this level of violence reveal about the socio-economic or other factors that lead men to settle conflicts through physical violence?
When you take into account factors such as apartheid, such as colonization, and you look at how emasculated men have been historically in South Africa, especially in the working urban environments, you see how that behavior was easily taken back to the homesteads and how it affected the women and the children there with discipline, with resolving conflict in relationships, and with the misconstrued understanding of what a masculine identity is supposed to look like. So all of those aspects of it really contribute to how men behave or treat conflict. And as it stands in the country, and speaking as a man, we are taught in how we grow up that your first point of solving any conflict has to be informed by who has more power than the other. We do this amongst each other as men, we do it with children, and we do it to women.
KG, knowing what we know about the drivers and the context, the historical context, let's run through some of the major focus points in the South African government's plan to address GBV and also where the gaps are.
Government's efforts to reduce and respond to violence is outlined in the National Strategic Plan for Gender-based Violence and Femicide, and this is built into these 6 pillars around accountability and leadership, prevention, justice and respond, support and healing, economic empowerment, research and information systems. And the idea is to target root causes of gender-based violence and femicide and provide longer-term cultural and structural change. And so in this guideline, the interventions are around survivor support, which is still limited. Just looking at the number of shelters that survivors have access to, or the availability of shelters in relation to the demand that exists at community level. Other gaps that we are seeing in around the justice system is the processing of gender-based violence cases. There's a lot of backlog in the processing, which has led survivors to withdraw cases. And the limitations even in the sexual offences court, the limited capacity of individuals that are available to process the high cases is still very much prominent. And so the concentration of the national budget towards survivor support is of course warranted, just looking at the high cases. However, prevention efforts can really be scaled, and aspects such as economic opportunities or economic empowerment efforts, which can assist survivors in getting their voices and agency and power back, but also can serve as a violence prevention mechanism.
Thanks, KG. Just explain how the economic empowerment of women can serve as a violence prevention intervention.
When there is economic dependency towards one partner, say a male partner, that imbalance then implicates or limit women's ability to negotiate condom use or have a say in their relationship. And so that superiority comes in from the male partner. And even as Kolping has mentioned, that also plays in terms of how they resolve conflict. And so giving women that agency and empowerment allows them to make decisions around entering relationships based solely on interest and match rather than dependence and survival. Another area around economic empowerment of women as a way to reduce gender-based violence is around when women experience violence, they often stay in those abusive relationships because their options are limited in terms of survival. And so they are able to live easier or make that decision easier when they are empowered economically.
Absolutely. Kolping, KG sort of outlined government's plans and identified where the gaps are. What are some of the global efforts to prevent and end GBV? Are they looking to proactively involve boys and men? Are there examples of this playing out in the South African context?
So if you look at developed countries, you will see that there is quite a lot of coordinated efforts to develop and guide and mentor young boys as they navigate their understanding of masculinity and manhood. It is quite lacking in the South African context. We have not, as Heroes Academy, experienced a similar organization to us. And by that, I mean an organization that runs a mentorship-based character development program for boys so that they can develop a healthy understanding of their masculinity in a safe space where there is no judgment, there is no discrimination.
Tell me a bit more about Heroes Academy and what is the theory of change behind this organization's work?
Okay, so at Heroes Academy, we run a mentorship-based character development program that uses socio-emotional learning approaches to develop a healthy understanding of masculinity in high school boys and help them develop core values that they want to exhibit or encompass in their developmental journey as young men. So in the short term, we aim to provide an understanding of toxic masculinity. We aim to provide an understanding of positive masculinity, and we aim to give the boys an understanding of core values like honesty, responsibility, vulnerability, emotional intelligence. We aim to develop an understanding of that so that young boys can understand what it is to be honest, what it is to be responsible, be able to identify individuals who exhibit those traits in their lives. In the long term, we hope to instill a sense of understanding what it is to be a good man in society. And we aim to ensure that boys are able to use what we guide them with in our workshop as they are growing up in their lives, in their home environments, in their community environments, and in their schooling environments. The core values that we teach them apply holistically, and the conversations that we have with them are informed by perspectives that they share in relation to the core values that we are teaching them in the workshop. In the longer term, we hope to develop these young men into good men that are going to be responsible for themselves, for their families, and take responsibility in their communities and become models and examples for the next generation of young men on how one can develop a healthy relationship and understanding of masculinity and the masculine identity.
And just to be clear, this high school program isn't happening in affluent areas and in affluent schools. It's being rolled out in low-income communities, in Cape Town's townships in particular. What is it about these communities that necessitate a program like this?
The communities that we work in have very high levels of violence generally. And the communities that we work in, we have identified that there is a big lack of positive male role models across the board.
I believe that more than half of children under the age of 5 are not living with their biological fathers. They may live with other men in the household, but not necessarily their biological fathers.
Exactly. And what that contributes is there isn't an immediate role model, male role model to look up to and to see how one can develop into a good, responsible man. So what young boys in the communities that we work with do is they go and find a role model, a male role model outside the home environment. So you will find a role model in the streets, and, having grown up in communities like Nyanga and Philippi, I know it firsthand how when you look at someone who drives the car, has the fancy clothes, affords everything, we look at that and in our teenage brains, we translate that as being good until you get to know that, oh, that's a gangster, oh, that's a drug dealer, oh, that's a criminal. And all of those things go into this immature understanding of what a good man is supposed to be, of what healthy masculinity looks like. And as we grow up, that becomes part of what we are forming as an understanding of a good man. And it then takes a lot of growing up, unlearning and learning afresh entirely on just what defines a gentleman, what defines a good man, and what is my relationship with emotional intelligence, vulnerability. All of those things go a very long way towards informing what a boy is going to grow up and become as a man. And with a lack of a very good foundational role modeling of what a man is supposed to grow up and develop in their value system to be of a positive contribution to society. Boys don't interact with that until they come back from initiation in some cultural context, and they have to learn that all over afresh at that age, which is, a bit too late. So starting that as early as possible will give us an opportunity as a country to shape and guide that development of a masculine identity in young boys. So the communities we are in have exhibited those factors.
Thanks, Kolping. So this is an after-school program operating in low-income communities where, as you say, there are high levels of violence. Why are these conversations with boys not happening with girls as well? What is the thinking behind isolating them and not incorporating girls in this after-school program?
That's a great question. So what we have learned over the past 5 years, and actually including our pilot, is so in the after-school programs environment, I'm going to put it like that, we have noticed in the schools that we are in that you have quite a lot of blended life skills development program that, provide space for boys, space for girls, where, there's a safe space, they can learn, share with each other, express themselves. And you also have programs that cater for girls, women empowerment, programs that, talk about, sexual development, that talk about skills and values that, a young girl needs to develop in themselves in order to become, a formidable woman in South Africa. You don't seem to find that in the public schooling environment in our country at all, actually, in all the communities that we have gone to.
For boys.
Yes, certainly. So you don't find that in the after-school environment for boys at all. There isn't a space where boys can come and without a fear of judgment, without a fear of discrimination, without a fear of being told that their opinions don't matter or are not valid. You don't find a space where young boys can come and just express their understandings, their perspectives, their opinions of the world. So that's one of the factors that informed that decision. But I think most importantly, it is also noteworthy that from my experience when I was in school, and I was involved in quite a lot of programs in the after school programs, when a space is blended with both genders, I would tend to be very reserved and careful about what I share in that space. I would tend to be very careful in how I navigate expressing opinions that I carry. Whereas in our space, boys express themselves fully, and they understand that we are not there to tell them that what they think or what they feel is right or wrong, but we are there to establish a foundational point where we can be clear about their understanding of certain concepts about manhood. And then we are able to begin an unlearning process from that, and we are able to develop and guide them to embrace new and different and positive understandings of concepts like consent, especially in a sexual context, being a responsible man, embracing vulnerability, and understanding emotional intelligence, safe spaces for expression. So all of that sort of informed our approach in the decision that we are going to work exclusively with young boys so that we can provide a space that they can embrace, that they can own, and that they can be entirely vulnerable towards.
KG, I want to bring you back into the conversation. Aside from these types of programs that focus on boys and men, what other types of violence prevention programs are we seeing around the globe that could be brought here to South Africa?
So we have seen that economic empowerment is fostering healing and restoration of survivors of violence. But even strengthening community-based interventions, just recognizing that or leveraging community-based spaces and those frontline workers in Lusikisiki and in Thohoyandou, and bringing them into the conversation to co-design interventions that address their real and felt needs is going a long way in terms of just creating community solutions around gender-based violence. School-based violence prevention spaces are also important in us looking at alternative ways to prevent violence. The school is such a protective factor. You have learners that are still in a stage that they are receptive to learning behavior, how they interact with each other. And so teaching, modeling, and reinforcing positive norms and non-violent behavior can be included into the school setting, but also pulling men and boys as allies, as partners, and as leaders in the violence prevention space is going to be important. And as the sector is still emerging, we do identify that there is still even language that needs to be developed that's positive and is going to allow men to come through as leaders and even influence other men, rather than maybe how we've been pulling them before in a more accusational way that hasn't been very productive.
Okay, so there's a lot that we can do in the school space, in the home space. Heroes Academy starts at high school, and I understand that's an operational decision, because starting in primary school would mean that you might lose continuity when learners change schools. So starting in high school is an operational decision. But KG, surely we should be starting really, really young. Like these behaviors, harmful gender norms, all of that is ingrained and embedded from a very, very young age. How early do we need to start if we truly want to build a non-violent society?
The key is to work with caregivers, because developing self-regulation and executive functioning in childhood reduce later violence and antisocial behavior, which is a protective factor, because responsive and nurturing caregiving provide and establish a safe and a stable environment for a child as they are growing, and this shape their impulse control, their decision making, and their emotional responses.
Kolping, let's talk a bit about self-regulation, because self-regulation is really important because it teaches you how to respond rather than react to a situation, right? And so as KG explained, the early years, making sure that there's a nurturing and caring environment for their child can help build that, for brain development, but also self-regulation. Talk me through what you've experienced working with the boys in high school, where perhaps that self-regulation wasn't strengthened at a very young age.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with KG, first of all. What we've experienced in our program is the outcomes or the consequences of dysregulated young boys informs a lot of their academic progress and the relationships that they are able to build. So in the school environment, we've experienced and actually had reports and disclosures about, firstly, how one cannot sit through like a lesson. Period in high school will be anything 45 minutes to 50 minutes. You have boys that cannot sit still and be focused in that time frame, who may disrupt or interrupt others, who may disengage totally from the lesson, and that carries out into the relationships that they develop with each other. Conflict is resolved with aggression and violence because one cannot get to a place where they process their anger healthily, where they process frustration healthily, where they process disappointment healthily, where they process heartbreak healthily. So just with immediate high school relationships among friends or first time dating, we experience boys that struggle with what I've just mentioned. And how it plays out in the home environment is it then affects the relationship that has existed between the parent and child right up until the age of puberty, for example. And you then start to see a rift, a toxic rift in how a young boy addresses his mom, in how a young boy addresses his aunt, in how a young boy behaves or conducts himself towards younger siblings. So these are some of the effects that do come up in our workshops, shared by the boys. And we then, because we have anger management components throughout our curriculums that we use. So we are able to guide them on self-regulation techniques and skills, on what one can do in a triggering situation or a situation that makes them angry, so that at the very least, the first thought that comes to your mind is to calm down, not to put up your fists and solve whatever you are experiencing in that manner.
Kolping, what advice do you have for NGOs that either work with schools or have boys in their programs?
Oh, that's a big one. Firstly, I would say, please, from the bottom of my heart, do not stop. It is very much needed. It is very much necessary. And you may not see the results or the changes in the moment during the time that you are doing the work. But developing character and mentorship is a very long journey. It's a lifelong journey. Becoming a good person is a lifelong journey. I always say in my culture, Xhosa culture, when young men come back from ulwaluko, the initiation rite of passage, what has happened in what they are supposed to learn there, they are supposed to be educated on the journey of manhood when they are integrated into society. But there's a miseducation that misconstrues that understanding for them, that when they return, they think they are men. They think they are complete men. They think they cannot be taught anything. They think they cannot be guided. They think they cannot be corrected, which is totally false. That's not true. Learning and becoming a man is a lifelong journey. And it is something that you will never stop developing. So my advice to organizations would be, look at the work that you are doing as a lifelong contribution to the betterment of your community. Not as something to put on a report. Those are important for funding, but not as something to put on it to make a funder happy, but as something that is contributing to the very fabric that holds a community together. If you are working in that space, please don't stop, because that's what you are contributing.
Do you think that there's enough donor interest in boys' development?
Short answer, no, not enough. But a bit of expanding on that, I would say to someone who is interested, is not in the civil society space, I would say find organizations that are working on what you are passionate about in your community. You want to work in mentorship, find organizations in your community that work in mentorship. Go to schools, find out what is available. How can you be of good contribution to already existing efforts? We tend to want to reinvent the wheel quite a lot. Whereas if you do just a bit of research, just find out what already exists, you can see that you can be of much better use contributing to a vehicle that is already moving, instead of figuring out how you're going to build an engine for a vehicle that needs to move today, but you need to build an engine for the next 5 years. So that's one thing. Another one would be begin very small. Begin at home. We all like this idea of beginning formally, being registered with everything that needs to be registered. But as a regular Kolping from Nyanga who sees all of this play out in my community, within my family, you can start as small as possible. Before you want to change the community, what are you doing to transform your family? Before you want to transform your family, what are you doing to inform yourself so that you are of better and quality input to the family and community that you are trying to change? So start very small.
KG, a golden thread throughout this conversation is that there simply isn't enough investment in violence prevention, services and programs. What can NGOs do to push for that type of investment?
Thanks, Rahima. I think violence prevention can first be positioned as a cross-sector issue. Across departments, it doesn't sit in one line or sector of work. And so for some people, they're already even doing the work towards violence prevention. So it's just packaging and gathering evidence at local level to prove scalability and define their outcomes a bit better. Copeland spoke about coordinating the ecosystem a little bit better and breaking the silos that exist at community level. So plug yourself into local, district level structures and work at that local level to start coordinating the national effort. Community level involvement is very important. The co-designing of programs with communities, just acknowledging that they've been doing the work even informally, but that they also carry valuable insight in program design. So including them in the conversation around priorities. I think even as government is now looking to scale and organize and fast track implementation around GBV, is to bring in communities or community level organizations to the conversations to work around priorities together.
That's so true. Thanks, KG, because violence prevention is everything we spoke about. It's about boys' development. It's about economic empowerment for women. It's about nurturing caregiving when a child is very young. So it's about recognizing that all contributes to building a non-violent society. And now, over to you, those listening to this podcast. Using what you have heard today, you can try this reflective exercise. You'll need a pen and paper to write down these steps or download the takeaway sheet from our website, dgmt.co.za, and go to the podcast section. Write down the following questions and spend some time reflecting on them by yourself, and then share your reflections with your colleagues. Question number 1. If we know that violence begins in homes, in schools, in silence, in hopelessness, why does our collective response still only mobilize once the harm is already done? Question number 2. What are we investing in as civil society to prevent violence early? And question number 3. What would it look like if society measured success not by how well we respond to violence, but by how many young people have never encountered it in the first place? This is DGMT's Learning Lunch. Until next time.